Hey everybody, well thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us here as we start our conversation and as we start this book study covering the book of Ephesians. We've covered up to this point the book of Colossians and Philemon as well. The resources and teaching content for that can be found above here on our website. And we're going to jump into this conversation around Ephesians. We're going to start this study the same way we do any study, the same way we started Colossians, the same way we started Philemon. And in fact, the same way that we would encourage you to start any of your own personal studies, whether that's devotional, or maybe you're really looking to read to understand and grow more in what the letter's saying, I would encourage you to start reading any book of the Bible this way. And how we're going to start is we're going to look at 5 questions. We're going to answer 5 questions. And from the answers of those 5 questions, I firmly believe that the content that we will be engaging in will only make more sense to us as a result of these 5 basic questions. Here are the questions. Who wrote the book? In our case, again, we're going to be looking at Ephesians. So we're going to ask who wrote Ephesians. We're going to ask the question, to whom was the book of Ephesians written? We're going to ask, when was the book of Ephesians written? We're going to ask, what literary style or genre type was the book of Ephesians written in? And then finally, we're going to conclude our time together talking about some of the main themes of the book of Ephesians, as well as was there a specific purpose in mind? Was the author trying to talk about or remedy a specific subject or purpose in the writing of this letter? So again, we're going to take the next few minutes and jump into these 5 questions. So let's dive in. Awesome. Well, we're going to answer question number 1. Question number 1 being, who wrote the book of Ephesians? As you open up your Bible, as you read the first line of Ephesians, you're going to find out the author of the book right away. It's going to tell us that Paul is the author of the book. Now, again, what we want to do in this time as well is just acknowledge that there are other things out there. There are people who might have different opinions, that there are some other schools of thought. And one of the main reasons why we want to do this is we don't want you to be alarmed. As you go off during a personal time of study and you're maybe engaging with these questions by yourself, the last thing we would want is to say, yep, Paul wrote the letter, and let's close the book on that, and then have you come across some literature or anything else out there that actually says there are people who don't believe that Paul wrote the letter of Ephesians. We want to handle that together. We want to handle that here in this environment, to be honest about some of the scholarly disagreements, and at the same time to place ourselves in line with what Orthodox Christian belief and faith has largely held to for a long time. That a majority of these ideas or concepts are not new. They are not something that has just recently popped up based on a new development. And again, I think it's important to note that a majority of these are not overwhelming in terms of the disagreements here. So when answering the question, who wrote the book of Ephesians, it is absolutely appropriate to open up the book, and as you're reading, you see that Paul is mentioned as the author. And for the sake of transparency and for the sake of communicating those other things, we want you to know that there are people who do not believe that Paul wrote the letter of Ephesians. And perhaps some of their main objectives as to why Paul didn't write the letter of Ephesians are going to be twofold. First and foremost, as we talked about with the book of Colossians, there are those who would say, well, we don't believe that Paul wrote the book of Colossians, and also because of that, actually, we don't believe that Paul wrote the book of Ephesians. One of the things that we'll see as we talk more about the content of Ephesians is the themes that are developed between these 2 books are incredibly similar. So at one level, whether or not someone believes that Paul wrote the book of Colossians actually is going to influence whether or not they believe Paul wrote the book of Ephesians, because the content of these 2 books are so similar that they can't disagree that probably who wrote Colossians also wrote Ephesians. So again, because they don't believe Paul wrote the book of Colossians, there's some doubt or disagreement around the book of Ephesians as well. The second objection that those people would have that Paul actually was the author of Ephesians, is going to be around a Pauline expression of greeting. Generally speaking, when you read an epistle of Paul, you're going to have him communicating authorship. He's going to say something to the effect of, I, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus. He's going to go on into a prayer of kind of thanksgiving and praying for the people and being grateful for the people there as well. But we don't see that in Ephesians. In fact, we won't see that kind of prayer until the end of chapter 1. And so there's some disagreement as to if this was a Pauline letter, meaning that it was written by Paul. You would find that prayer of thanksgiving, you would find that content directly after Paul kind of identifies himself as the author and the audience, which is normally closely followed. So the discrepancy between some of the layouts of the book of Ephesians are some of the main reasons why there are some people who don't believe that Paul wrote it. An overwhelming majority out there believe that Paul is the author of Ephesians. And for our sake, moving forward, we are going to ascribe by that theory. We are going to believe, we are going to teach, and we are going to say that the author of the book of Ephesians was Paul the apostle. Great, well, let's take a look here at question number 2. Question number 2 is going to be, to whom was the book of Ephesians written? Now, again, upon first reading and maybe even upon saying the book of Ephesians, we might have the answer jump right out to us. Well, Ephesians is written to the people of Ephesus. In fact, I believe it's in verse 2 that the text actually says to the people of Ephesus as well. And so again, for our purposes, we are going to move forward with the belief that Paul wrote this book to the people of Ephesus. Now, for the sake of transparency, as we've done before, we want to acknowledge that one of the chief reasons why people do not believe this book was written to the people of Ephesus is because some of our earliest manuscripts of Ephesians actually don't have that phrase in there that would tell us that this was written to the people of Ephesus. In fact, it won't be present in there. And again, not to alarm you, we want to be honest and transparent about that. And we also want to maybe play that train of thought out just a little bit. And what I mean by that is, okay, if the earliest manuscripts, as they do, have that verbiage absent from them, does that mean that this book is still not written to the people of Ephesus? Does that have to mean that? I would argue no. And I would argue no on a few fronts. Here's one of them. One of them would be this. If you received a letter in your mailbox, or someone knocked at your front door and gave you a letter, and the letter wasn't addressed to you, but you somehow received this letter. And upon reading the letter, one of the things that you noted is that it was speaking to your circumstance, to your situation, maybe even, as we'll see in the book of Ephesians, to your ethnic background. Would you have any doubt that that letter was for you simply because it didn't say to whatever your name is, whoever you are watching this? My guess is that that wouldn't dissuade you from believing that that letter was to you. Now, again, that's just one of maybe the trains of thought that we can play out, that simply because it didn't say to the people of Ephesus does not mean that the content that is present wouldn't speak to the people of Ephesus. In fact, what we'll see throughout the book is that Paul makes a great effort to speak to the Gentile believers. And what we know about the community of Ephesus is that it was filled primarily with Gentile believers. So again, there's some significance there that's important for us to note that says, well, while it might not be written to the people of Ephesus in the earliest manuscripts, some of our later manuscripts have that. And even if they didn't, that does not mean that the content still might not be applicable to the people of Ephesus themselves. And a second train of thought would be this, and we've seen it in the book of Colossians as well. It was customary for these letters to be circulated around communities. In fact, the book of James might be one of the primary examples of this. It wasn't written to a specific church, but was written for the benefit of the church community as a whole. So it was written and distributed, and once one church was done with it, they would actually pass it on to another church community, and so on and so forth. And what we saw in the book of Colossians is, on Paul's instructions, he actually is writing to the people of Colossae, and on his instructions, he tells the people of Colossae, when you're finished reading this, I want you to take this letter to the community and to the believers of Laodicea. Now, Laodicea was a community that was close proximity to the community of Colossae. It was roughly 9 to 10 miles away. And Paul commands the people, although the letter was written explicitly to the people of Colossae, Paul commands them to take that letter to the people of Laodicea because it would be of benefit to them as well. So again, simply because a letter like Colossians is written to that people group does not mean that it still wouldn't speak and be of value to another people group. And we can apply that same sort of logic to the letter of Ephesians. While again, that phrase may be missing from our earliest manuscripts. One, they are present in later manuscripts. And two, simply because that phrase is absent does not mean that the content there may not be directed specifically for the people of Ephesus or the community surrounding Ephesus at large. So, answer to question number 2, to whom was the book written? For our purposes here in this study, we are going to ascribe by the theory that says the book of Ephesians was written to the people of Ephesus. Great. Well, we're going to look at question number 3, having answered the first two being who wrote the letter, and the second one being to whom was it written. The third question we're going to answer here now is when was the letter written? The time frame with which a letter was written or a book in the Bible was written can tell us some very significant things. So again, let's take a look at what we know of the book of Ephesians. Now, again, there are some date discrepancies here. But for our purposes, we're going to place it sometime between 60 and 62 AD. Now, here's the significance of those 2-3 years of time difference. And we saw this again as we dealt with Colossians and Philemon, and now as we deal with the book of Ephesians. During that time of 60 to 62 AD, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. We know this from the book of Acts. It's told to us that Paul leaves Ephesus itself. He goes to Jerusalem. And upon entering Jerusalem, he's meeting with the elders there, and there's some tension that exists between the Jewish people and Paul, because some Jewish people are starting to stir up this belief that Paul is telling Jews and Gentiles alike as he's teaching them the gospel. He's telling them that it's okay to throw out everything with the law. So the elders of Jerusalem, they actually instruct Paul to go to the temple with these 4 men who are completing a Nazirite vow and hey, show the people of Jerusalem that you're okay with some Jewish tradition. So Paul does what he's instructed, and what we see is it doesn't work. It does not work. In Acts 21, we have this faction of Jews from Asia, the scriptures tell us. It says that they come around Paul and they start to rile up the crowd. And in fact, they rile him up so much that the crowd seizes Paul and they are intending to kill him. Now, there's luckily for Paul, there is some Roman officials that kind of come and separate him, and Paul, being cunning as he is, at the beginning of chapter 22, he asks, hey, can I speak to the people of Jerusalem? And he's speaking to these people, he's proclaiming the gospel and kind of Paul's testimony, and it gets to the point where Paul tells the people that he was called by the Lord to speak the gospel to the Gentiles. And in verse 22 of Acts 22, it says, at this word, they were listening until this word, and at this word, there was a massive revolt. Paul is again kind of imprisoned in Jerusalem, and the revolt was so extreme, in fact, that Acts 22 tells us that it was under the cover of night by escort of 200 Roman soldiers that Paul was taken from Jerusalem to Rome. And now Paul's in Rome and he's awaiting trial, and they don't really know what to do with him because he's again kind of playing some social and political cards well, and they can't really do anything to him based on his citizenship. And so they just kind of put him on house arrest for 2 years. And those 2 years are from 60 to 62 AD. So it's believed that during this time, Paul wrote 4 primary prison letters. And it's going to be Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. So again, for our consideration, when was this book written? It was written between 60 and 62 AD, and it was written during Paul's imprisonment in Rome. One of the other kind of telling features to this would be the similarities with which Colossians and Ephesians would thematically develop. the way in which Paul would use some of the same language, some of the same analogies, some of the same thought patterns and progressions in the writings as well, that would lend itself to this idea and belief that these two letters, Colossians and Colossians and Ephesians, were actually written around this same time. So answer to question number 3, when was the book written? The book was written between 60 and 62 AD. Great question 4. Here we go. In what literary or genre style was the book written? Now, if you're just joining us here in this study of Ephesians, first, thank you again for taking the time to join us here. I believe firmly that this work that you are putting in, whether it's with a group, whether it's by yourself, it will pay great dividends and there will be good fruit that is produced from it. But if you're just joining us here, maybe this conversation of, what do you mean, what genre type or what literary style is this book written in? Maybe that's a really unfamiliar train of thought or way of thinking about the Bible for you. And if that's true, that's okay. But let me just maybe help you understand why that conversation is so important. Now, imagine with me, if you will, that we're walking into Barnes & Noble. And as you walk in, there's all these books scattered across the store. And what we know is that at the top of all these different areas where these books are, there's going to be these signs. And these signs are going to help us to see what types of books are found where. So for instance, if you go into Barnes & Noble and you want to find some historical biographies, you're going to go to the very back left section. Now, don't ask me how I know that. I don't want to show all my cards that I'm a nerd, but the back left section is going to be somewhere where the historical biographies are. If you're looking for some Christian literature, it's going to be just in front of that, but still in the back left. If you're going to be looking for some nonfiction or some fiction literature or some cookbooks, right? We're going to go to specific areas. Now, here's the key. When we get there and we pick up the nonfiction book and we open it, whether or not we're conscious of it, we are understanding that there are certain rules that apply to different literary types. If I open up a fiction book and I start reading a fiction book, but if I start reading a fiction book believing that what I'm reading is true, it is a true story with true people, I can get myself into trouble. Maybe not serious trouble, but trouble nonetheless. Again, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, so if I open up Harry Potter and I start to believe that Hogwarts is a real place, and I go to King's Cross Station and I try to go through platforms 9 3/4, I might get hurt, right? Because that doesn't exist. They are fictional characters in a fictional world, and we read it as such. Similarly to nonfiction, when we read nonfiction, we understand that what we're reading is based in historical truth. Again, poetry. We understand that when we read poetry, there's expression and beautiful poetic language that's very visual and maybe draws out emotion. But we're not going to expect to see that exact same language in a historical biography. There are rules, written or unwritten, conscious or unconscious, that apply to these literary genres that we think of as we approach different works. Now, with that in mind, we're not asking you to do anything with the Bible that is unique to the Bible in that sense. In fact, on the issue of literary genres, we're asking that we would read the Bible as literately as we would a historical fiction book, right? Because there are rules that would apply that help us understand what is trying to be said. So, with that in mind, let's consider what type of literary style is the book of Ephesians. And as we will see, the book of Ephesians is written in epistle or letter form. It's written by someone to a group of people talking about a specific set of things, whether that's beliefs, whether that's actions, whether that's things that are taking place within that community. It is written as a letter expression to the people of Ephesus by Paul. And with the understanding that it's an epistle, there's a few things that tells us right away. Again, as we open up the nonfiction book, there's a few things that it tells us when we know it's a nonfiction. For example, with an epistle, we know that it's going to be from a specific person to a specific people for a specific purpose. We know that that's going to be true. We know that generally epistles will deal with ideas of theology and ideas of how the gospel would impact your life. So they're going to be heavily practical when compared to something like maybe the Gospels. We know that epistles are going to talk about how that gospel reality of theology, how the gospel itself, how Christ crucified impacts your life, and we're going to be called to live out as an example or an outflowing of that. And finally, with epistles, it will be incredibly helpful, and this isn't true just for epistles, but it is true for epistles. It would be incredibly helpful for you, for us, for me, to do some historical background work. And what I mean by that is understand what's taking place when this letter is written, in the community that it's written to. That will help us receive the content that is written to that people well. We looked at Colossians. One of the main reasons why that book was written was to combat a form of Gnostic heresy that started to influence the church. So with that in mind, when you read through the book of Colossians and you have an understanding of what some Gnostic heresy could look like, you're able to understand and see that letter in a light in which it was originally intended to be received. So again, for the book of Ephesians, we know that it's an epistle or a letter form, and we know that with epistles come a few general rules that will help us to understand the content well. On to the last question of what are some major themes, or what is the major purpose of the book? Great question 5, last one here as we wrap up. We're going to be looking at what are the main themes, or what is the purpose of the book of Ephesians. We're going to do a little bit of that historical work that we ended question 4 with, to place ourselves in an understanding of what was happening in the community of Ephesus around this time. If you look at Acts chapter 19, what you will learn is, you will learn a lot about the community of Ephesus as a whole. You'll learn a little bit about their religious practices. You'll learn a little bit about who the power players were. And essentially, here's what you're going to learn. Ephesus was a community where there was a heavy influence of temple worship centered around the goddess Artemis. Now Artemis, there was actually a moonstone that fell from the sky, and that moonstone was centered, or was placed in the middle of this temple of Artemis. Now the temple of Artemis, side note, little history nerd action, it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So it's an incredible place. It's a place of very historic value outside of the biblical narrative. But this temple was in the community of Ephesus. And as a result, there was lots of tourism, if you will, or traffic around this temple. And so people had their livelihoods invested in this Artemis temple worship. People like silversmiths and craftsmen and people who made relics of the like. They all centered their business around this temple, and their business practices were centered around the worship of Artemis. Now, there's a pretty big Christian influence that starts to happen in the community of Ephesus, and we see that in Acts 19 with Paul. Paul's preaching the gospel. Many people are coming to know Jesus, and we get information that tells us that a riot's about to start. And the power players that start this riot are those who have financial obligations that potentially could fall through as a result of Artemis not being worshipped. So we see things like silversmiths and tradesmen. We see that these are the people who start this riot against Paul, because these are the people who have the most to lose if Christ and Christian worship starts to infiltrate this community of Ephesus. Now, Ephesus itself is a major geographical player in the New Testament. We see, again, even here in the book of Ephesians that it's written. It's made reference a lot in the book of Acts. 1st and 2nd Timothy are written to Timothy, Paul's kind of protege, who at the time is a pastor in the book of Ephesus. And we also see Ephesus show up in the book of Revelations as well. So Ephesus is a pretty big hub of the Christian faith in the early church movement. So it does have some significance on that front. Now, in terms of the purpose, as we had just briefly discussed last time in this last section of question 4, Colossians was written to address, at least in part, the specific heresy that was called Gnosticism that started to infiltrate the church. So one of the main purposes of the book was to set right the tensions and the confusions and the doubt that were a result of this Gnostic faith tradition. Now, for Ephesians, we don't have anything like that. We don't see in the book of Ephesians Paul talking necessarily about the tensions between Artemis worship and the Christian worship. We don't see anything specific in nature on that front. But one of the main themes that we'll see in the book of Ephesians is this conversation of Gentile believers being grafted in to the family of God. That's something that's all throughout the book of Ephesians. Paul talks over and over again about the significance of the work of Christ Jesus and how that impacts not just the Jews, but the Gentiles alike. Now, this is a significant message for the people of Ephesus to hear because they themselves would be considered Gentile believers. Another main theme that is present throughout the book of Ephesians is going to be unity or oneness, specifically within the church. We're going to see in chapters 1, 2, and 3 this conversation where Paul talks about the unity that's found amongst the people, both Gentile and Jew, as Christ himself has reconciled two people into one, and that they are now one people of God functioning as the instrument of the church to reach the community. We're going to see the conversation of the Spirit of God in a way that we have not in the book of Colossians or Philemon. In fact, within the first 14 verses of Ephesians chapter 1, we're going to find that there is some layout of some Trinitarian doctrine. Trinitarian doctrine just simply means that we believe that there is one God who is existent in three distinct persons: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. We're going to see that mentioned, and we haven't seen that yet in the book of Colossians. So that's going to be a pretty big theme as the book continues to develop as well. Now, there is going to be many more themes, but the themes of unity, of oneness within the church and the community, and the theme that's centered around the development and the presence of the Spirit of God at work within God's people, granting them strength, helping them to understand and experience the love of Christ Jesus and God the Father, is going to be a theme that will be very present throughout the book of Ephesians as well. And there you have it, the 5 questions that we're going to ask of any book. And the questions, as we've answered them thus far, are: who wrote the book of Ephesians? To whom was it written? When was it written? In what literary or genre style was it written? And finally, the last question is going to be, what are some themes, or what's the main purpose of the book of Ephesians? I hope that this was helpful for you. And if it wasn't, stick with us. I promise that it will make more sense as we continue to go. But would you tune in to the upcoming video covering Ephesians chapter 1 as we continue on this book study in the book of Ephesians?